Good evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Patrick Macaulay. As a member of the advisory committee for the Institute for Religion and Science at Chestnut Hill College, I would like to welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. A particularly warm welcome to the many who are here for the first time. The Institute for Religion and Science was established 13 years ago to promote a constructive engagement of religion, spirituality with science and technology, and to encourage a dialogue that is interfaith, multi-science, and civil. To this end, we sponsor lectures, a reading circle, and other events. Do check our website for resources, particularly for past videos and for our blog. Also, be sure to sign up for our mailing list to help you stay aware of upcoming programs. I will now pass this off to Michelle Frankel, who will introduce our speaker for tonight.
So it's my pleasure this evening to introduce to you Professor Marc Shultz from Bryn Mawr College. Marc is a professor of psychology on the Sue Cardas Ph.D. 1971 professorship and directs the data science program at Bryn Mawr. But he comes to us tonight wearing his hat as the co-author, along with Robert Waldinger, of the New York Times bestseller, The Good Life: Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness. The book grows out of the author's work with the Harvard Study of Adult Development, a longitudinal study spanning more than 8 decades, which began with a number of young men from Boston and now includes thousands of individuals, men and women alike. Since 2014, Marc has been the associate director of the study. Marc received his Ph.D. in clinical psychology in 1994 from the University of California, Berkeley, and followed that with a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard Medical School. Marc joined the faculty at Bryn Mawr in 1997. He studies emotion and stress processes and the effects of relationships on mental and physical well-being, exploring basic questions about the dynamics of emotion processes and the ways in which they affect and are affected by relationships and life transitions, such as marriage. Marc's work has been supported by the National Institute on Aging, the National Institute for Mental Health, as well as many foundations. In addition to writing The Good Life, he is the author of dozens of peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. You can also find his writing in the wider world, including the Wall Street Journal and the Atlantic. It has been my privilege to teach with Marc in Bryn Mawr's 360 program, where we have thrice taught a series of integrated courses on mindfulness and contemplative practice. Marc's on the psychology of mindfulness. Marc is a fabulous teacher, an extraordinary scholar, and a delightful writer. Marc will give us some perspective tonight on the links between happiness and the relationships we have with each other. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marc Shultz.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be with you this evening, both people in person, and I have to remember we have folks on Zoom too. I'm really excited to talk to you today about this study. I want to start by thanking Kathy Duffy for reaching out and inviting me. This is my second visit here. So I'm delighted to be back. We were trying to remember how long ago it was. I think it's about a decade since my last visit. And thank you, Michelle, for that lovely introduction as well. Michelle, as many of you know from this community, is an incredible teacher. So she's also an incredible colleague. So it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm going to talk about our study and some of the themes in our book, and I'm going to do that in the same way that we do in the book, which is I'm going to give you some science. After all, this is the Institute for Science and Religion. And that's the sort of middle part. I'm going to try and ease into it with some stories, and I'm going to try and tell some stories about the science as well. And I'll squeeze in a little bit of ancient and some modern wisdom as well along the way. I'm going to start by telling you a story about these two young men who were born in the early 1920s, John Marsden and Leo DeMarco. They were part of the study that Michelle alluded to that I will talk more about. John Marsden grew up in Ohio. He was born into a family that became wealthy when he was young. They succeeded in business. It was clothing business that they were in. And they considered themselves outsiders in the town that they were in. They were kind of new to wealth, and they all felt like outsiders, including John. John grew up as a good student, but felt like he was teased a lot in school. In fact, he describes being bullied until he hit adolescence when he became a big guy. And some of the teasing stopped because he became a little intimidating to others. He was always in his head and knew it. So when he thought about his future, he was particularly concerned about finding an occupation in which he could think and do the things he liked to do with his brain, but might not involve having to interact with others because he was less comfortable in that sphere. He went on to Harvard. He was a good student in high school, went on to Harvard. He was a philosophy major at Harvard. Made a decision early on not to pursue his family's business and to pursue his own path. World War II broke out when he was in college, and he volunteered, as did most of the participants in the study, to serve in the war. He flunked his medical exam, so he ended up serving stateside during the war. He excelled at Harvard. As I suggested, he was a very good student. He applied and got into the University of Chicago, which at the time, as is now, is one of the nation's top law schools. He excelled at Chicago, really enjoyed it more than Harvard. Harvard he felt was very constraining, too many rules and regulations and prescribed courses. He really enjoyed his time at Chicago. During that time, he told the study that he wasn't going to marry for a while. He wanted to become established in his career. He went on to work for a leading law firm. He also did some teaching at the University of Chicago and consulting for the federal government. Highly successful career. And he married at 34, which for this cohort was quite late. Leo DeMarco grew up in an upper middle class family in Vermont. It was a very close family. It was a religious family, although Leo went to church when he was a kid. He said he didn't really believe in most of that stuff and wasn't particularly religious as he got older. He was an okay student, but in high school got inspired by an English teacher and became a really good student. He was also a track star, and he went on to Harvard. He was really interested in literature and history. He was a history major, but he was particularly interested in writing. He had a dream of becoming a writer for his career. He was an incredibly reflective and observant person, and he frequently wrote down what he saw happening around him. When the war broke out, he volunteered. He passed his medical exam, and he served in the Navy in the Pacific Theater in combat for several years during the war. During the war, his dad unfortunately passed away. It was a kind of sudden death that was unexpected. And towards the end of the war, it was becoming clear that his mom was beginning to have some medical problems that took a while to figure out, but it turned out that she had Parkinson's disease. And he moved back to Vermont to help out the family and to be with his mom. When he did that, he just took a job at the local high school teaching history, and he remained in that job for the rest of his life. I should say when he served in the Navy, he took very copious notes, like a journal that he kept with the hope that he would publish that journal once he graduated. The illness in the family and the high school teaching job sort of took precedence, and he never got to be a writer. He did, within 6 months of moving back to Vermont, he met Grace, the love of his life. That's his description. And they remained married until Leo passed away late in life. So I want to talk a little bit about the origins of this study. It began as 2 studies in the late 1930s. And both of those studies were focused on human thriving. So instead of the typical focus on pathology or disease, these were 2 studies that were interested in what leads to people flourishing in different circumstances, very different circumstances. And I always like to pause to note it was a peculiar time to think about human flourishing. This was the end of the Depression. It was the eve of World War II. Fascism was in the air. People were worried about the future of the planet in a different way than we worry about now. But these 2 studies began in 1938. 724 original participants. 2/3 of those participants came from inner city neighborhoods of Boston. These were Boston's poorest neighborhoods, so these were kids growing up in incredible disadvantage, facing real challenges in daily life. They were adolescents when they began the study. Most of their families had emigrated to the United States from countries that were either they were fleeing poverty or oppression in those countries. Most of them lived in tenement buildings. More than half of them didn't have running water in their tenement buildings. So very poor circumstances. John and Leo came from a different cohort. The remaining 1/3 were 4 consecutive classes of men from Harvard College were invited to participate in a study, again focused on human thriving, though in very different circumstances. Not all of these participants were privileged. Many of them were on aid. I think about 50% were receiving financial aid. John and Leo happened to come from privileged families, but they certainly had privileges that the inner city boys were not enjoying. Their perch in life was quite different. All 724 of these young men were followed across their entire lives, followed very closely, as I'll talk about soon. So young adulthood, middle adult, late age, right to the end of their life. Almost all of the original participants have died at this point. Along the way, we expanded the sample, so the original sample was all male. Wives of the original participants had been participating in the study really for the last 40 years or so, but for that first 20 years it was informally. When Bob Waldinger and I became part of the study, we invited them formally to become part of the study. Since I teach at Bryn Mawr College, I always feel obligated to say what they told us, which was it was about time that they were part of the study. We're now studying more than 1,300 of their children. There are a few remarkable things about this study. One is that close to 90% of the people that began the study in the 1930s continued that study until their death, which is remarkable for a longitudinal study. And more than 2/3 of the children of the original participants are now participating, which is also extraordinary. So, how did the study work? The study from its very beginning was really interested in trying to get inside people's heads and understand what their experience was like, what they viewed as their challenges in life, their excitement. So the beginning of the study, there were extensive interviews with all 724 young men or adolescents. There were visits to the homes, interviews with the parents, observations of the interactions between the parents and the children. There were medical exams of all the participants, and there were very careful measurements taken of their bodies as well, which I'll talk about in just a second. Questionnaires over the next 80, we're now in the 86th year, about to be 87 years of the study. Questionnaires about every 2 years, and these were lengthy questionnaires, some of the traditional questionnaires psychologists asked at the time and continue to ask, but also open-ended questions, and they would feel free to write lots of feedback for us, like you're asking the wrong questions, or here's a better way to ask this, or here's what I really meant after I circled 3. So there's a lot of qualitative material in these records as well, in addition to the interviews. Medical records regularly about every 5 years, and interviews about every 10 years over the length of the study. Last 21 years or so since Bob and I are involved, more modern techniques like brain scans. We collect blood so we understand a little bit about how their immune system is functioning, how genes are being expressed, inflammatory patterns in their bodies. We bring them into the lab and observe them very carefully under what we think are interesting circumstances. So one is we stress them out. The best stressor to give people is to ask them to imagine they're talking in front of a room full of people. We also give them difficult math tests with a lot of pressure. Hurry up, let's get the answer. And we see how their bodies react and how quickly they can calm themselves after they get stressed out. We also observe them interacting with their partners and other ways of trying to understand how they're functioning both relationally with others and also how they're feeling inside as well. We're interested in. There are a few big lessons. This is a study, again, that's gone on for over 86 years, hundreds of scientific papers. I think our book is the 16th book that was published with data from the study. But there are a few big lessons. The first should not be a surprise to anyone, and this has been replicated by a number of other studies, which is we really want to take care of our body. As I get older, I like to say, and let's imagine we might live 100 years if we're really lucky, and we want to take care of it as if it's going to be around that long. So it means not smoking, it means drinking alcohol in moderation. More and more data talks about that in itself may be complicated as well, but certainly not over drinking or excessive drinking. And we need to move our body. It's really important. As we age and as we develop health problems, really important to have appointments with healthcare providers as well. This was a study long before I was involved. George Valiant, who was the previous director, talked a lot about our defenses or our ways of coping with adversity. And one of the things that's very clear from studying the lives of these folks from 724 families is that stuff happens. So the war broke out. The Korean War broke out. There was the upheaval of the 60s. More recently, we had a pandemic. That stuff happens both to everyone, collective societies, and it also happens to individuals. So the way we meet challenges, our ability to adapt to those challenges and overcome some of the things that are put in front of us are really critical, and that includes the emotions that are engendered by those challenges as well. And then the last bucket that I want to talk about are social factors matter, and I'm going to talk about them in two ways. One example soon, and then I'll come back to them. And relationships matter, and that's the core of what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk. So this is one piece of science snuck in early. It's a simple figure with the college men in red, and in purple are the inner city boys or men. And on the horizontal axis is their age, and on the y-axis or vertical axis is the percent of the sample that had either died or had sufficient difficulties in independent living that they were classified as disabled at that point. And I'll bring your attention just to age 65. By that point, there's a 30% differential between the college sample and the inner city sample. It's quite a dramatic difference. I can put it a different way. On average, the inner city sample lives 10 fewer years than the college sample does. These are old data. These were people born in the teens and 20s here. But that persists if we look at the difference in life expectancy today in the United States between college educated and non-educated. It's about 8 years, that difference. So huge disparities that have to do with socioeconomic background. It's not just education, it's a complex of factors related to that. About 5 years ago, maybe a little longer, Bob and I stepped back and we said, we're getting old. Do we want to keep writing in journals for academics? And is that what we want to do with the rest of our life? And Bob in particular was interested in trying to take some of what we were learning and see if there was a lesson or set of lessons that we could bring to a larger audience. So we did what most scientists might do. We tried to look at what kind of findings we have. What's the sort of signal in those findings? And there was a kind of complex of findings around relationships. I want to share with you some of the headlines that we were thinking about. If you're trying to predict how people are doing physically and emotionally in their 80s, not in the 1980s, but when they're in their 8th century or 9th century of life, the best predictor is their relationship satisfaction at midlife. It's not their cholesterol level. It's not whether they came from the inner city or they were privileged enough to go to Harvard. It's not how successful they were in their jobs. The best predictor is their relationship with their partners in their 50s. If we're interested in trying to understand how they're doing in late life in terms of their intimate partner and navigating some of the challenges of late life intimacy, particularly as we have more physical needs and perhaps grow more dependent on our partners, a strong predictor were those ratings that were done in the 1930s. This is just remarkable when they went into those homes at the beginning of the study and rated how warm the parents were with the kids, how consistent they were, and how structuring they were in those relationships. Those ratings predicted the quality of late life intimacy. They also predicted how well people coped with challenges in midlife, which I suggested is really important as well. This is a finding true from many other studies besides ours. We happen to follow people very closely over an 8-day period. We asked them a lot of questions about what they were doing and how they were feeling at different points during the day. And it's clear that on days when people spend more time with others, they're happier. And then the last one I'll highlight is kind of a look towards where the future of research is going. Those ratings we made of the quality of late life relationships actually predict how well people do on cognitive tasks 3 and 5 years later. So we ask people memory questions and things that get more difficult as we age. People who were in better quality intimate relationships, particularly women, showed less declines in their memory across that 3 to 5 year period, which is a kind of suggestion that there may be something protective for our brains about relationships. So let's go back and revisit John and Leo. They were followed across their life. This is now when they're 42 years old in 1967. Favorite part of the job, John says, creative parts of the job. He's working in a law firm. The research, he liked to do the research and the writing. His least favorite, he didn't say people, but he came pretty close. He said pushing paper, and he said the bureaucrats that run this place. I don't like them. Leo, teaching history, teaching generally the students. I'd hate to give up more courses. Leo was so successful, he was being asked more and more to take on administrative roles, and he resisted doing those. Things he doesn't like, there are a few academics in the audience grading exams. Can't imagine why he says that. 1975, they're age 50. John is earning, not surprisingly, 3 times what Leo is. The only surprise is that nowadays that would be even bigger, that discrepancy. Series of true-false questions. Life has more pain than pleasure. John, true. Leo, false. I often feel starved for affection. John, true. I also want to say John is now on a second marriage. He divorced his first wife, and this is the second marriage that he's talking about. I often feel starved for affection. Leo says false. A man feels good when, this is a fill in the blank. John, the philosopher, talked about himself. He was able to respond to inner drives, his inner needs is what he was talking about. Leo, very different. He senses that his family loves him despite everything. 1987, age 62. When you're upset emotionally or sad or worried about something that is not related to your wife, what do you do? Again, John's second wife. I keep it to myself. I tough it out. Leo, I go to her. I talk to her. It's very natural. I certainly don't keep it to myself. She's my confidant. 2004, they're age 79. 5 adjectives to describe your relationship with your partner. This is part of the evaluation of intimate relationships. John, tension, distant, dismissive, intolerant, painful, pretty good last summary, painful relationship. Leo, very different, comforting, challenging, feisty, pervasive, beautiful, also a nice summary. So summary, John, incredibly successful, wealthy, professionally well-respected in his field. Can't imagine him being more successful on that front. Very much focused on himself. These were men that grew up in the 20s and 30s, but also lived through the 60s. And for John, this was an exploration in what was important for himself and his needs. Didn't go well. He ended up feeling quite isolated and estranged, not just from his partners, but also from his children as well. He was probably one of the least happy in our study. Leo didn't get to pursue that dream he had of writing. I would have liked to have read his journals. He's a really interesting guy, reflective and thoughtful. Very modest salary, arguably a modest but important job. But he was a beloved teacher by generations of students and also other teachers. He was an important mentor to other students and colleagues. He thrived through relationships at work and at home, very close to his wife, Grace, the love of his life, very close to his children and his grandchildren as well. He was one of the most happy individuals in the study. So these are case studies. I'm really obviously trying to use them to communicate a point here. I do want to talk about some of the limitations, not just of talking about John and Leo, but other problems in the study. There were these measurements that were done of all the participants at the very beginning, all 724 of them. The first set of measurements were very careful classification of their body types, and this was the nicer part of it into endomorphs and mesomorphs and ectomorphs. There was a belief that body types dictated your personality that was quite prevalent at the time and affected how adaptive you might be, particularly under stress and challenges. The less polite part of this is there was also a lot of discussions about Aryan-looking bodies or Germanic-looking bodies. There was a lot of emphasis on femininity and masculinity, so there was a lot of work done around what they looked like on the outside. They also took very careful measurements of their brains, their skulls, not their brains, their skulls, although they did EEGs, which is incredible back then in the 30s. They did that, and we have those records. But they also took measurements on the outside, their skulls, and there was an interest in different shapes of the brain and different contours of the brain, again, how that might influence personality. These are ideas that have never proved to have any validity in psychology and modern science, but this was a kind of curious detour. The study was also all male at the very beginning. I kind of love and hate this title. This is the first book, and the first book was about the Harvard study, not about the whole study. So great title, What People Are. I really like that title, but the problem was that this was Harvard students. It wasn't people. really. And the subtitle was A Study of Normal Young Men. And we all know that if you were wanting to study normal young men, you wouldn't start with a sample of Harvard men during that period. So these were some of the issues around the study. Bob and I thought still important findings here. And the way that you deal with this in science is you look for replication. That science is about replicating findings across samples, across methods. So in the good life, we're really interested in robust findings that were replicated widely, regardless of the methods, regardless of whether the study started in the 30s or in the 2020s, across culture, ancestry, and gender. So the findings I'm going to talk about are generally replicated across cultures and these kinds of divides. I'll even talk about studies of studies where we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people from all around the world. Animated by the kinds of stories that I've started to tell you, a little bit of wisdom sprinkled here and there. And the book also includes a lot of suggestions for how we might all live a kind of more fulfilling and happy life. And I'll end this talk, after I depress you with our current state, I will end this talk with what I hope is some uplifting ideas about how we can live a happier and healthier life. So after Bob and I realized there's a theme there, maybe there are things that we can talk about in a book that would be of interest to people, we had to figure out what it was the key message. And scientists don't like saying things in short, simple sentences. But here's what we came up with, and I feel so good about this. 6 years later, I think we did a good job. Good relationships keep us happier and healthier throughout the lifespan. It's as simple as that. If you need to go, now's the time to go. That's all you need to know. I'm going to unpack this a lot, so I want to start by noting that it's all kinds of relationships. I highlighted intimate relationships in the examples, but it's all kinds, and I'll make that clear in a second. And I'm going to focus on the next few slides mainly on the healthier part, because I think that's the more surprising piece, that our relationships might have some impact on our physical health. It's not surprising that the moments when we're happiest, we might be with people that we care about. So I promised a little bit of wisdom, so here's some ancient and modern wisdom. I'm going to start with some Buddhism. Ananda, who is one of the disciples to the Buddha, I've realized that half of the path to the holy life, this is in conversation with the Buddha, I realized that half of the path to the holy life is made of good friendships. The Buddha responded, no, Ananda, friends are not half of the holy life, they are all of the holy life. Emily Dickinson, modern wisdom. We had a discussion about Amherst and Mount Holyoke. Emily Dickinson is the poet of Amherst. My friends are my estate. Forgive me than the avarice to hoard them. I love that quote. Proverbs, a happy heart is good medicine, and a cheerful mind works healing, but a broken spirit dries up the bones. So for an amateur like me, this is about mind and body, and you'll see some evidence of research on mind and body here. That's a sign we're going to the science. Okay, so I want to start with a wound healing study, and there are going to be a sequence of things I'm going to tell you. Psychologists do bad things to people sometimes, and this is one of the things they did. They took a little piece of skin off of people's forearms, the inside of their forearms. It's a punch biopsy. The piece is the size of like a pencil eraser. And they were interested in watching how long it took for those wounds to heal. They took pictures every day, like the pictures you see here, and on average, those wounds took about 4 weeks or so to heal. People who were in relationships that were filled with tension, these are marital relationships filled with tension or dissatisfaction, on average took about a week longer for those wounds to heal. People who are caring for those with Alzheimer's, so they were caretakers with a huge burden, their wounds took longer than that to heal, almost 2 weeks longer to heal. So the metaphor here is important. This is why I start with this. Relationships literally get into our body, under our skin, and affect our health. A hand-holding study. This was a clever study done by James Cone at the University of Virginia. He too caused pain for people. He exposed people to, I think it was a source of heat, or he pinched them in a different version of this. But he put them in a brain scanner as he was doing this. And in half of the participants, they randomly assigned folks to a condition in which they got to hold the hand of someone while they were in the brain scanner. What he found is that people who were holding the hand of others had less activity in the parts of the brain that we think are where pain is perceived. And the folks that were holding the hands of loved ones had even less activity in those areas. And we know this. I used to work in hospital settings with kids that were getting bone marrow transplants and other horrible procedures. And holding hands and touching is an important part of medical care. This is just a strong example, a research example of that. I'm going to bring you through a series of studies. I'm going to start with a study that looked at 5 studies. This was a famous study that was published in Science when I was in graduate school. It got a lot of attention. It's complicated. I'm going to focus in on the key parts. So on that vertical axis is age-adjusted mortality. You can think about this as likelihood of dying at any age. We're only going to focus on 2 of the 5 studies that they collected data. The first is in Evans County, Georgia, which is a rural county west of Savannah, Georgia. And the other one we're going to talk about is Finland. But in Evans County, they compared Black residents to whites, and they found that Black residents had a higher chance of dying at any age than whites did in Evans County. So there are disparities that have to do with ancestry and complicated socioeconomic factors that are linked to that in the United States. And those 2 groups didn't compare to growing up in Eastern Finland. At any age, you were likely to live longer in Eastern Finland. Another way of saying that is that people live longer lives in Eastern Finland than in Evans County, Georgia. But that's not the critical part. There are all sorts of disparities, and you can again look at these 5 samples on that vertical axis. The key part is when we look at social integration on the horizontal axis. So these are indicators of connection to others, asked in a variety of different ways. Do you have people in your life who can support you when you have challenges? Are you happy with your friends? Do you have friends? How many friends do you have? Asked differently across these different studies. They all show essentially a downward trend there, which we can summarize by saying that people who are more socially connected have less risk of dying at any age. Doesn't matter where they live, where they came from. This is consistent across those 5 studies. 5 studies, someone's going to say, not a big deal. Okay, 148 studies, 308,000 participants all around the world. If I asked you strongest predictors of death, you would come up with many of these. I'll start at the bottom, hypertension, this is high blood pressure, and then obesity is a risk factor. The width of those orange bars gives you an idea of what the risk is for premature death. Moving up higher, physical mobility, physical activity is important. Alcohol consumption, this is abstinence versus excessive drinking, so it's an extreme. And then at the top is smoking. It's the best predictor of premature dying. What's missing are all the data on social connections. Again, asked lots and lots of different ways. And if you look at the width of those bars, they're at least as wide generally as smoking and probably twice or 3 times that of obesity. So no matter how you ask the question, do you live with someone? Are there people in your neighborhood that care about you or know who you are? Doesn't matter how you ask the question, there's a link with better physical functioning, less disease, and less likely to die at an early age. So here's the part where I promised you I was going to bring you down a little bit. This is the part that to me gets depressing. So that's neat knowledge, right? We want to lean into relationships. Why am I up here talking about this? Because there's signs that we're having trouble with this. So I'm going to go through some data that I think is depressing. If you look at Google searches, here's what you find. People are going online to ask the question, how do I meet people? How do I meet new people? Where do I make new friends? I feel lonely. This is data right up to 2024. So across the pandemic, these trends continue to go up post-pandemic. Really good study. The Bureau of Labor Statistics every year does a time use study. It's an extraordinary study. They get very detailed portraits of how people spend their time in the United States. This is representative samples, really good data. I'm going to make this a little simpler by just showing you that the 5 things that I have the blue arrow going down, those are all various indicators of social engagement, how much time we're spending with others. This is from 2003 to 2019, so this is pre-pandemic. It got worse during the pandemic. That trend that was going down continues to go down, not as steeply as it did during the pandemic. The only one that goes up, the orange one, is social isolation, has increased. These are general trends across the population. It's worse if we look at young people, so these are people younger than 25 that were part of the study. In this 16-year period, there's almost a 2-hour drop per day in how much time they spend with their friends. I'm going to say that again because to me it's remarkable. In 16 years, a 2-hour drop in how much time they spend with others, their friends. So for me, growing up, this was time after school. It's gone. Young people today don't have that time. Here's another indicator. This is, again, data right up to the pandemic here. Percent of teens who say they go out with friends 2+ times a week. 1976, that was up around 80%. That was when I was a teenager. 2020, it's down close to 50% at this point, so a very dramatic change. We can look at the workplace. This is more recent data, 2019 to 24. Here you do see a pandemic dip here. People increasingly less likely to know who they're working with on a personal basis. They just don't have a sense of who those folks are. They don't know them. And this, people report feeling more lonely as well because of that. It's not just remote work. It's a smart audience here, so you might think, well, it's because we've gone remote or hybrid. That may be part of the story, and we can talk about it. But there are lots of settings in which people feel very isolated from others. So this is a photo of a warehouse. People can walk for miles in these warehouses without seeing other people. In fact, they're not supposed to talk to other people when they see them. Lots of work can be very isolating. Recent data, 16 to 20% of folks, this is Gallup data from 2023 and 24, across all settings. It doesn't matter whether it's remote, in person, whether it's fully on site or in an office. Large numbers of people are reporting feeling lonely a lot of their day at work. So loneliness is a problem not just at work. Lots of estimates of loneliness in the United States. Best estimates always put it somewhere between 20 and 55% of people in a given week feel lonely. Estimates vary widely depending on the questions that they're asking. Young people feel particularly lonely, and in some studies, older people also experience loneliness at rates that are higher than other people. Let's just put it in the middle and say about 1/3 of the public feels lonely in a given week. Why is that a problem? Because you saw the data that connected social connection to risk of dying. So the UK, 2018, was way ahead of the curve. They were ridiculed to a certain extent. They appointed a minister of loneliness. There really is a minister of loneliness in the UK, and we'll talk about some of the things that they've done. The US has caught up. In May 2023, Vivek Murthy, who's an incredible Surgeon General, issued a public health advisory, which is the top advisory that the Surgeon General can make, about a crisis in connection in the United States, and he's been very active working on these issues. It's a beautiful campaign, so I'm going to read you part of the campaign. You can find it online. It's very clear and very effective, the message. What if there is something in our everyday lives that can transform our whole health and well-being? Something that can decrease the risk of developing and worsening heart disease, anxiety, high blood pressure, dementia, depression, diabetes. It exists. It's something that needs to be cared for and nurtured like a garden by all of us. It can create healthier, more prosperous, and resilient communities. That something is called social connection. So this is the Surgeon General. Remember, when I was young, the big report was smoking causes cancer. There was a huge discussion about whether we had the scientific evidence to decide this. Think about how far we've come as a society to recognize something as perhaps more difficult to measure and to quantify that is connected to these physical health outcomes. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit in my closing time before we open up for discussion and the tradition of breakout rooms here. I'm going to talk a little bit about things that we can do to live a better life. I always spill that, so I'm not even going to try and close it. So the first is similar to the Surgeon General's advice. Actually, the Surgeon General is a fan of our research, so I'm not sure who took what from whom here. But we think prioritizing connection is really important. And in fact, we think that people should be thinking about their connections as a kind of social fitness, just like we think about physical fitness. So this idea comes from an observation of the participants in our study. It's clear that people have key connections in their lives that wither over time. That many, it's quite sad, like in our interviews of folks in their 70s, particularly the Harvard men would say things to us, you know, this is the Harvard study. Do you remember my roommate, John, who I had sophomore? Do you have any idea what's happened to John? And we don't know John because he's not in the study, but more importantly, this person has lost touch with John, who at one point was an important person in that life. When we ask people in their 80s about regrets, everyone has regrets about their lives. 75% of the regrets were about relationships. I should have spent more time with people I cared about. I should have been kinder to my wife, to my husband, to my kids. I should have worried less about getting things done at work and more about how people were doing. I should have put more time into keeping up my connections with others. That's what they were about 75% of the time. So the antidote to that is that we need to be intentional and proactive. We live in a period of time when people are very busy and there are a lot of distractions, with distractions being things that we carry around with us. So somewhere in my pocket, I have a phone. This is one of our chief distractors, and we'll talk more about that. But in order to move against the tide here, we really need to be proactive and kind of resist that tide to worry about other things. So it might start with taking stock of how you're doing in your relationships, what's working for you, who are the people you're spending your most time with. Might you change some of the folks that you're spending time with if you're not spending time with the folks that are most energizing for you, the people that give you uplifts and a sense of energy when you've been with them. We want to seize the moment and carve out time, so that means regular time with people that you care about. Today I've been lamenting, I don't know what got me thinking about it. There was an old graduate school friend who I met up with over the summer. We said we miss each other a lot. Let's do some walks. He lives on the West Coast. Let's do some walks and phone calls when we're walking. And we did that for 2 times, and we got off the pattern here. I want to get back on the pattern. I miss Jeff and would like to continue to do that. So we want to carve out the time, make it a regular part of what we do. Also helpful to remind the person why they're important to you. People like being reminded of that, and it helps bring you closer as well. Reconnecting, like I did with my friend Jeff, is a good thing. It's never too late to try and reconnect with others. The worst thing that happens is it doesn't work, and you're in the same place that you were before. Depleting relationships are more complicated, so for some of us, they may be relationships with relatives, it might be with our partners in life, it could be with people that we work with. Those require work to figure out how to move forward. The key is that all relationships have conflicts, and there are things that we can do to make relationships better. One of the tricks in relationships is it's a two-way street, so if the other person has no interest in working on that relationship, it's going to be challenging to do something. So we may also have to make difficult decisions in our life about whether we want to remain engaged with some of the folks that are giving us that sense of depletion. I have been talking about this a lot, and with the figures suggesting at least 1/3 of people feel lonely in a given week, we need to change how we think about loneliness. It's not unusual people that are lonely, it's many people that are lonely. It's common for people to experience loneliness. Again, young people, these are university-age people, kind of crazy to imagine, where they have close physical proximity to thousands of other people like them that may share similar interests and activities. They report very high levels of loneliness. So there's something that we've done as a society or a culture that's helped create this loneliness, and we need to normalize the experience instead of demonizing it is the key idea. Steps, again, include intention. Research has made it clear that there's a certain number of hours it takes to really feel a connection to people that we're getting to know. The magic number is supposed to be somewhere around 40 or 50 hours. Those connections tend to deepen when we do things side by side with others, an activity. Typically, we begin to reveal more and more of ourselves, intimate aspects of ourselves over time, and it's that repeated contact that helps us make connections with people. Find an activity that's of interest to you. I looked hard for some fun gathering of the Institute for Science and Religion. I didn't find a good graphic, so I left pickleball up there. One of the great things about pickleball is that there's a lot of downtime and it's pretty social, and that's one of the secrets of why people like pickleball. Volunteering is great. You can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You can give meaning to your life, help others, and also improve your connections with others. When Bob and I wrote the book, one of the more interesting things that we started to think a lot about are the terms that we use when we talk about attention and presence. We give people our attention. We pay attention. We spend time with others. Those are monetary terms that we talk about that suggest that these things may be really important resources, and yet we give them away a lot. On average, adults are spending 10 to 12 hours a day on screens. Some of that is at work, but a lot of that is outside of work, scrolling through things on phones. So we're giving up our attention to others, and those companies, of course, are making lots of money on the attention that we give them. So we need to think about attention as a precious resource and think hard about where we lavish it. And I'm going to make the argument that we want to lavish it on an important priority, our social fitness, which is connecting with others. So it means showing up, making that time to be there, and when you're there, being present. And this is something really important. It's true for all of us. I talk about this a lot with my students. Just being in class isn't enough. You also need to be there and open to listening and being present. When I teach, one of the things I do is I come to class early. I talk to them, actually. But another thing I'm doing is being in the room and getting ready to teach. I taught with Michelle for years, and I know Michelle does the same thing. She has to be there in order to be a good instructor. We all have pretty basic needs. It's about being seen and heard and understood, and that's what we want. And to do that, we need to be curious. So we need to be present, attentive, and curious about people's experience. So that means asking questions, letting people know that we're hearing about their experience, and maybe it's different than ours, and that's okay too, that we're learning from that and acknowledging that those differences exist. Really important to think about ways to combat some things that take us away from being able to do those connections and to be present. So stress makes it very hard to be present and attentive to others. So we all need to learn how to manage stress. There may be things that organizations can do to make our lives easier and less filled with stress, but learning how to cope with stress is really important. Technology is a big distractor. So one of the things that's been interesting to me, I knew when I wrote the book and started talking about it, I would hear people talk about their children as being on their phones all the time. What I didn't anticipate, and it's taken this form a lot, a young couple that's just had a precious grandchild, the parents come to visit their grandchild, and they're on their phones when they're visiting, and the young parents can't believe their parents can't put the phones down for a certain amount of time. This is a problem that we have across the lifespan. People have become fully distracted by it. Phones also enable people to get out of conversations that they don't want to be in, so they're also tools for people that are perhaps shy or worried about conversations. So we have to learn how to navigate that challenge. This is the last cruel thing psychologists do to people. This was a great study done in Chicago. People mostly commuting on the elevated train or the L, some took the bus. These psychologists grabbed people before they got on the train. They said, how are you feeling? Series of questions about emotions, their feelings in the moment. What do you usually do on the train? And this is particularly important because it's in Chicago, right? The friendliest Midwest city of Chicago. What do you do on the train? Well, I kind of zone out. I sleep, I listen to music, sometimes I listen to a podcast, someone who wrote a book, occasionally I'll read something, but probably not. Sometimes I try and do work. Do you ever talk to people? Oh no, I don't do that. Why not? Because they wouldn't be interested in what I'd have to say. It wouldn't be very productive. I just don't do it because I don't want to be intrusive or feel like people aren't interested in what I'm doing. People literally sounded like they were in high school and people weren't going to like them, is what it sounded like. The cruel thing psychologists did, half of you randomly are assigned to talk to strangers, the other half get to do what you usually do. They caught them at the end of their commute and asked them again, how are you feeling? The people who talked to strangers, their mood improved. They described feeling more energized. Here's the kicker. How productive was the commute? The people who talked to strangers said the commute was more productive than the people who tried to do work. What does that mean? Because we don't all take a train to work. It means maybe we talk to the people who serve us coffee in the morning, or the person who sets up the audio for a Zoom call, or cleans the office that we're in, or delivers our mail. That when people have those conversations, they generally experience a kind of uplift in their life. It's energizing. In fact, I hear stories of people telling their partners, "You'll never guess, I spoke to the guy who serves me coffee. I've been getting served coffee by the person for a year. I've never had a conversation. This is the excited voice. I just can't believe it." And they're still talking about it the next day to their partner. I can't wait to go back there now. So Chicago's one place. This is a study that's been replicated in other cities. I spent some time in Switzerland. I've talked to people in Switzerland about this study. They say, "Well, you know, you lived here. In Switzerland, we never talk to strangers." Well, in the United States, there are lots of prescriptions against talking to strangers. So some of you may recognize this popular commercial. This is Dr. Rick on the left of the screen, who is coaching middle-aged people who are starting to act like their parents. And this particular poor gentleman in the middle is committing the sin of talking to strangers in the elevator. And Rick is saying, you know, tisk, tisk, we don't do that. So all societies have some prescriptions against it. People have told me, they yell out in the middle of my talk, they'll say stranger danger, right? That we have all sorts of worries about what it's like to talk to strangers. So the trick is figuring out ways to overcome that. Not all circumstances are unsafe. I get the concerns about safety, but there are also benefits to this as well. There's another important thing to highlight from the study. When you ask people what's going to be good for them in terms of their emotional health, they say not talking to strangers. And it turns out it's an uplift. So those decisions you make Friday night when you're tired and your partner says, "Let's go to the party," and you say, "I don't know that I really want to go." Sometimes when you go, you feel better. Not always, but sometimes when you go, you feel better. One of the things they did in the UK are these things called chatty benches. I love this example. So picture a park and there's a bench. You walked around for a while, you're tired. You sit on the bench, someone comes sits next to you. You kind of nod at them. That's what we do in the United States. Do you talk to them or not? There's that awkwardness of whether they're open to communication or not. So in the UK, what they did to combat loneliness is that they painted some of these benches a gaudy yellow color or some other colors. I think some of them are purple as well. And they put a big sign that said chatty bench on it. And that means if you sit at a chatty bench with other people, the expectation is that you will talk. They've changed the norms here, okay? So I'm going to suggest, as I close here, that one of the tricks in life is to create chatty benches where you can come together with other people and have conversations. That's what we all need to do in the places that we work and the places that we populate. That's a key thing for living the good life. So I'm going to stop there for questions. I know we do a little, let me stop and then we'll talk about the next step. So thank you. We're going to do chatty things. Do you want to come up and explain to everyone?
So we're going to take a few minutes. If you're online, we're going to do this in breakout rooms, and if you're live and in person, we're going to do the chatty bench. So you should gather in a group of 4 to 5 people. And this is your chance to sort of talk about what you heard, wonder what questions you might have, and then we'll all come back together again and ask Marc some questions and have some more conversation. So talk to each other. It's good for your health. So we're getting ready for people to come back from the breakout rooms as well. So the people who are on Zoom. Let me see if I can get everyone's attention back. All right. So Kathy, are you going to do the monitor from Zoom? Okay. So we're going to do monitor from Zoom as well. So do we have questions for Professor Schultz that people would like to ask?
What did you talk about on the chatty benches?
Questions, comments?
We have Zoom, folks. That's the...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So, curious about the happiness hypothesis, right? Like, how does hereditary or DNA play into how we quantify and qualify happiness? Just wanted to get your opinion with that.
So, trying to figure out the influence of genetics on a construct like happiness is complicated, and there's disagreement out there. So the estimates vary a lot, but I think the So our strongest estimates are probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 to 65% of our happiness levels are determined by our genes. And to me, that's a kind of ideal number. It means that about half of our happiness is left to our own devices. So the rest has to do with the circumstances in which we live, the things we do on a daily level, and our kind of experiences from day to day. And some studies suggest slightly higher than that, but that's probably in the right ballpark. Yeah.
Now that you have high schools that are beginning to say we're going to take your cell phones and you have to go the whole day without them, have there been any studies on whether happiness is adjusting in those environments?
Yeah. So many of you know that there's a kind of movement here to control the technologies that distract us a lot and do other things. So I didn't say a lot about this, but social media and technologies related to that also provide ample opportunities to compare ourselves to others, and that's particularly challenging for teenagers. So when I was a kid, I had to go outside to look at whether the neighbors painted their house and whether it looks nicer than our house or not. We don't have to leave our bed these days to compare ourselves to lots and lots of people, and the views that we get when we look online are highly curated views, right? There are people at their happiest or incredible moments. So this is particularly pernicious for teenagers and particularly pernicious for girls, adolescent girls. So there's been a movement to try and take away cell phones, both at schools and more generally. Maybe there's an age at which it's appropriate to have smartphones. Some of this is the result of a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation that's logged some of the mental health challenges of this generation. I think there's data that will be coming in soon about these experiments. They're not being done randomly yet, but I think we could do these studies. The data are pretty clear that when people use social media or the internet to compare themselves to others, they typically come out of that feeling less happy than they were before. But the internet and technologies can be used for good things, right? During the pandemic, it's hard to imagine how we might have survived without the technologies that connected us across the distance that we had. So part of the trick is learning how to harness the technologies, and texts have their place in connecting us to others, and Zoom calls are also important. But it's also clear, this is some of our own research and other research, that the less lifelike the technology is, so texts as compared to phones compared to video, and video compared to real life, we feel less connected to others, the less lifelike those interactions are. And people end up experiencing fewer emotions or less intense emotions. And emotions are actually what connect us. Is what allows us to mimic the other person's experience and to ask curious questions about what's going on with them. So we have challenges in this world. I think we'll have more data soon. I'd like to say I wish it were that simple, but I think it's going to turn out to be more complicated than that.
Mark, one of our Zoomers is interested in whether loneliness is more prevalent in the city or in the suburbs.
Yeah, it's a good question. No gender differences in loneliness. There are some age-related differences that I talked about, and the environment definitely has an impact on the degree to which we're likely to connect with others. So one part of the Surgeon General's campaign is about creating what he calls a social infrastructure in which people are more likely to be able to connect. And the idea there is that spaces that allow you to connect. So it's not physical proximity to others, being in the city versus a rural place. It's really the spaces that encourage connection. So the best example I like to give is, we have incredible gardens in this area of Pennsylvania, some of the most beautiful gardens in the country. And they're great to go to those gardens and to be with other people and to see other people, but you often don't interact with those other people when you're there. In a community garden, though, you're working side by side with other people, and it's not that hard to say, gee, your roses look beautiful, mine are dying. What are you doing that's different than what I'm doing? So I think the trick is not so much how many people are in one place. Again, college students feel quite lonely. That's the analogy to a city. It's really the circumstances in which people are coming together and the manner in which they come together. Sometimes I put a slide in there about this, but modeling is really important. So, lovely introductions here from Patrick and from Michelle. and then help set a tone for people. In class, again, I mentioned I come early to class, I talk to students, and then I'll say to a student, oh, Michelle, John, I think grew up in a place that's not far away from where you grew up, because John has got his face in the phone. So I'm doing a lot of the modeling for students, and all of us that have positions of leadership or have that capability, I think it's really important that we do this, because we have a generation of students, particularly the ones that are in college now, that missed some important years of practice for making those connections.
Absolutely. Other comments? Yep.
Aside from modeling, what other things do you suggest to kind of break that stigma of you stay here, you don't talk to anybody, you are in your own zone?
So I think, part of it starts with a kind of recognition that we all have that same voice in our head. It doesn't matter how outgoing we are or how introverted, that voice tells us that people aren't going to be that interested in us, or that there's a danger here, that I might sort of get myself in a position that's sort of hard to change. So some of the people in the Chicago study said it was like they were going to be on a transcontinental flight, is what they were imagining. They don't want to start a conversation because then they wouldn't know how to end it 20 minutes later, right? They wouldn't know how to end it. So we go through this in our heads about the potential benefits and the risks that are connected with making connections to others, and we tend to err on the side of self-preservation, which is we avoid the threat that may come when we engage with others. So it's being brave enough to quiet that voice down, saying, what's the worst that could happen? Waste 5 minutes or 20 minutes, it wouldn't be so bad. So I think that's the first part. And then it's often recognizing that it's typically less about us, so we're all worried about how we do in conversation with others, and more about being interested in other people. That's what promotes connection. So I think for a lot of people, knowing that helps them get out of the mindset that they need to be entertaining and be engaging in a way that keeps people in a conversation. Really, the way to keep people engaged is by expressing interest and curiosity about them.
Other questions?
So this one is
Another Zoom question.
another Zoom, yes.
You said Zoomies before. That Zoomies, yeah.
So this this woman wants to know if not very fine, if we have relationships with people that are not constructive, how about that? Is that destructive to us, or is it better, is it better not to do that? So what's the balance?
Yeah, so such an important question. Relationships are challenging, right? So this is a book about leaning into relationships, and we talk a lot about the fact that relationships are messy. We can't control them in the way that we want to. People are inevitably disappointed in relationships, disappointed with others. No relationship is perfect across all of one's life. So relationships are challenging. So we need to start there and recognize that there are things that we can do and not be surprised when we have those challenges in relationships. But the benefits that I'm talking about accrue to relationships that are generally doing well. Relationships that aren't doing well cause difficulties for our bodies. So the study that I talked about, the wound study, people who were in high conflict, low satisfaction marriages, it took longer for their wounds to heal. People who don't have people they can confide in, or people who know them, have a pattern of expression of their genes that makes them more vulnerable to disease, that makes them more vulnerable to viral and bacterial infections, and it makes their inflammatory pattern stronger. There's greater levels of inflammation. So we have to figure out ways to manage those relationships. Sometimes there are things that we can do. I'm a pretty loyal, this is a place where my co-author and I sometimes disagree. I'm a pretty loyal guy and optimistic, and I think there are lots of things we can do in almost all relationships. But I also think it's important, this is Bob talking more than me, it's really important to recognize that there are limits to relationships as well. Some people are mistreated or abused in relationships, and those are relationships that we may need to end. That they may not be savable. So those are very personal decisions, difficult to make, but yeah, not all relationships are good for us.
Another question from the audience here? Sure.
Thank you. Was there any link with faith formation, faith practice, and happiness?
Yeah, so the previous director of the study, George Valiant, really interested in this, and he continued after he stepped down to study this question. Our study is a bit of an outlier. It doesn't really show a connection between religious practice or spirituality, a sense of spirituality, and happiness, that those folks aren't better off than the others in terms of emotional well-being. But if you look generally at the literature, there's a small advantage. These are correlational studies, so I don't want to make it causal, but there's a small advantage. Folks who are part of a religious community, practice religion, or report greater belief in something spiritual are generally happier than others. Again, it's a small difference. There are lots of interpretations of that, and I think the interpretation that I lean towards, maybe not surprising, has to do with connections with others. So one possibility is that going to church or temple or any sort of religious setting, a friend's meeting house regularly, you're part of a community. It's where you share your challenges, you share your joys. Even the practice of praying with others, doing something ritually with others, people tend to feel good when they do things in unison with others in that a moment. So there are lots of potential advantages to being part of that community that are relationally based. Another possibility is that a belief in a higher power or a kind of benign power that leads us to good fortune or protects us in some ways. That's a relationship in itself, and it's a particularly important relationship that may be of value when people find challenges as well. So, that's a secular scientific way of thinking about some of those religious pieces, but most studies suggest that there's some benefit to religion. This is an institute that talks about science, so really important to say, we would never assign people randomly to be religious or not, or to practice certain religions or others. So I think the jury is out about why it is, but it does suggest there's some benefits conferred by being religious.
So for the last 5 years, I've taught a faith ed class at an Episcopal church up in Exton here, and it's a church where my wife works as a coordinator, and I've gotten to know the people there pretty well, and it's a very, a lot of people attend this church, and when they talk to me, who I'm not clergy, right, the number one reason they go there are people there who come to this who don't even believe in God, but they want the human connection,
Yep.
They want the community.
Yep.
The number one reason that 90% of the people I talk to who go to that on a week-to-week basis and get very involved is the community, is the human interaction.
Yeah. And I think, it's such an important idea to share because religious formal attendance at, whatever services of any denomination have gone down incredibly. They went down dramatically for good reason during the pandemic, and they didn't recover. So this is an incredible challenge to faith-based institutions, what to do about that. Students are pretty clear, when I talk to students, I teach classes where I'll present some of these data. That slide where I talked about, the difference between my childhood and their childhood, they're spending less time with friends. They say something interesting, which I think is important. During the pandemic, what they learned is that they really didn't have to leave their room. They didn't even have to get out of bed. That with their phones, they could watch streaming media, they could text their friends, keep up on social media, they could get food delivered to the house. There, they had to get out of the room unless their parents delivered it to their room. But we've learned to be resistant to going outside. So I was talking with Michelle about going to the movies. I don't go back to the movies at the rate I did before the pandemic. And I miss that. And part of it is, it's the same movie that you can watch at home, but there's something about watching it with other people. So this is a challenge that we face. It's partly driven by the pandemic, and it's partly, the pandemic was really an accelerant. These were things that were happening in society long before the pandemic, and they just got accelerated by the pandemic.
Very quick, I wonder if it would be possible, given that, like Surgeon General talking about this, could social interaction be a prescription?
Yeah.
Look, we need you getting out to the movies
Yeah.
once a month. Let me see your check.
Yeah. No, I love that. I mean, I think exactly, because the Surgeon General is talking about this, it gives, kind of meaning and legitimacy to asking about connections. So, doctors, I just went to, I'm having trouble with my knee. I went to a sports medicine doc, and they asked me when the last time I had a screening for It wasn't smoking, but it was something like that, right? This is the orthopedist. Now, he's doing that because he can bill for it, if he asks me. That's why he's asking whether I had a screening recently. So if we can incentivize this, right, to ask people about their social connections, I think it's really important. I'm going to tell a quick story we tell in the book. Near the end of the book, we have a chapter that's called It's Never Too Late, and we highlight the experience of an extraordinary man who lived a really difficult life. He was in a marriage that was not very satisfying. He felt quite separated, and I would say lonely in his marriage. His wife was not very social. They never went out, and he didn't have friends. So he was pretty miserable for most of his life. In his 60s, he was a clockmaker, and he loved doing that work. He was really good at it, fixing clocks and working with his hands. In his 60s, he started to develop problems with his eyesight at first, and then the clockmaking became more difficult. So he had to quit, and he made a series of interesting decisions that are relevant to this. One is he decided to separate from his wife. And the other is a doctor said offhandedly, maybe you should go exercise more, it'll help your body. So he went to the gym, and he went the same time every day, and he realized that if he goes the same time every day, the same people are there all the time. He had an interest in old movies, and what he started doing was making friends for the first time in his adult life. He brought people to his home to screen old movies. That was the connection to movies that I was having in my head. So for 50, 60 years, we asked this man, do you have friends? And he would say no, which is quite sad. And then in his 60s and early 70s, do you have friends? He would hesitate, and he would say, yes, several. So yeah, I think this would be a good, so my idea is the doctor should say you should go to the gym, not just for your physical health, because it gets you out of the house and in contact with people. Yeah. And other stuff too. I'm not going to prescribe pickleball for everyone, but it's whatever you like, whatever is important to you. Being engaged in a community, whether it's religious or not, getting out and being in the community is really important. We tend to devalue how important it is.
Okay, we'll have a couple more Zoomers. There are people
Are they
who,
Zoomers or Zoomies? Wasn't it Zoomies? Zoom.
there are people who could have bad relationships at work and good relationships at home, or vice versa. And so the question is, are these contrasts significant in terms of their impact on health?
Yeah. So relationships matter everywhere. Lots of research, I've done some of it, that the sort of boundary that we always imagine, particularly men, between work and kind of the rest of our life, it just doesn't exist. What happens at work spills over to the rest of our life. What happens to our families spill over to work. So we need to work on our relationships in both domains. The ideal is that our relationships are strong in both settings. If they're not, there are things that we can do. But I don't think it's ideal to just have them in one, as opposed to all the settings that we work in. I also don't think it's common to have every relationship work, right? So it just means that we need to think about the spaces that we're in. Michelle and I work with each other. We enjoy each other's company, so we've chosen to co-teach classes together or to take walks together. There are lots of people I work with that I don't get along with quite as well as I do with Michelle. So we have some choice in the spaces and places that we can populate. I also tell people, I tell students this particularly, this is like a secret that Bob and I figured out some time ago, that when we make commitments, we think hard about the people that we're working with, that we want to spend time with people that we're going to enjoy their time, the time with them. And that means they're pleasant, they're engaging, maybe they're playful, and they're interesting as well. Whatever that might mean to you. So I make some work decisions based on what I imagine these folks might be like to work with. And I think that's not a bad thing to prioritize.
And here's one more. What do you suggest for a spouse who must spend most of their time taking care of a spouse who has dementia?
Yeah. So one of the most difficult things to do, right, I gave you one hint of the data, and there's lots of other data there, that it's an incredibly stressful thing. So, we haven't talked a lot about why it is that relationships are so important. I've just tried to make the case scientifically, but if you think about it, relationships give us lots of things in life, but perhaps one of the most important is that they help us navigate challenges in life. So if you're in a situation where you're taking care of a partner, so many feelings to deal with, so many challenges. So my suggestion is for folks in that situation, finding support outside of the relationship with their partner is really critical. There are lots of communities of caretakers these days. The attempt is to provide some support and camaraderie as you're dealing with these challenges. It's not just dealing with the emotional challenges, they're practical things that people have to figure out. And fortunately, many people have figured out how to do some of the challenges that we face. So leaning into your connections when we're under stress turns out to be one of the major advantages that relationships confer on us. So I would say accessing people outside of that relationship, really, really critical.
Any more questions? Let's thank Professor Schultz one more time. And thank you, Marc, so much for the talk.
Thank you. Thank you, it was a pleasure.
And I want to thank you too, Marc. Thank you for coming back a second time. We'll try not to make it 10 years the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming too. It's wonderful. You had a good chance to put into practice what you've heard. And so come back again, all right? Thank you.